how could a war once distant suddenly ignite in the very heart of Russia's cultural capital? On the misty morning of October 4, 2025, St. Petersburg awoke not to church bells, but to the dull roar of explosions echoing across its industrial suburbs. For decades, this city, the Venice of the North, home to the Hermitage and the legacy of Peter the Great, had been portrayed as untouchable, a symbol of Russian refinement, immune to the chaos of war. Yet overnight, that illusion burned away in orange light. Drones launched from Ukraine had struck deep into Russia's northern flank, more than 1,000 kilometers from the front, targeting oil terminals and the Kirishi refinery that powered the entire region. According to reports verified by open-source analysts and Western defense monitors, the strike was not random, but part of a coordinated operation that exposed the weakness of Russia's billion-dollar air defense network. The attack was carried out with domestically produced long-range UAVs capable of low-altitude penetration, evading even the S-400 batteries guarding Putin's hometown. Western intelligence sources cited by Reuters and BBC News confirmed that this strike represented the farthest Ukrainian reach into Russian territory since the war began. U.S. officials speaking under President Donald Trump's administration described the assault as a defining moment in the energy front of this conflict. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute (RUSI) noted that the impact of such a strike went beyond immediate flames. It symbolized a psychological and economic blow to Russia's claim of invulnerability. St. Petersburg, often described as the Kremlin's window to Europe, has always stood for Russia's link to the West. From its imperial palaces to its Baltic ports, the city projected a sense of stability, wealth, and Western orientation. But when Ukrainian drones streaked across the night sky, that window shattered. Satellite images released by independent European analysts the following day revealed plumes of smoke stretching dozens of kilometers, marking the precise locations where critical fuel depots once stood. Why St. Petersburg? Because it represents not only Putin's personal power base, but also Russia's economic artery to NATO's northern frontier. Hitting this city was a message, one that NATO intelligence circles reportedly analyzed as a sign of Kiev's strategic evolution. According to Defense News, Western advisors had long warned that Russia's over-reliance on centralized refineries near major urban centers created Achilles' heels in its logistics. By exposing that weakness, Ukraine effectively demonstrated that geography could no longer shield Moscow's heartland. The local reaction inside Russia was swift and anxious. Residents recorded the buzz of drones overhead and shared videos before state censors could respond. Within hours, those clips spread across Telegram channels, showing flames reflected on the Neva River, a haunting contrast to the city's tranquil image. Russian officials dismissed the damage as minor, yet satellite thermal data told another story: multiple ignition points, some burning for more than 12 hours. The Kremlin's narrative of total control began to unravel in real time. The strategic repercussions rippled outward. Energy exports through Baltic ports, such as Ust-Luga, briefly halted amid fears of secondary strikes. European energy analysts estimated that the temporary suspension alone cost Russia nearly $250 million in lost export value over a single weekend. Meanwhile, NATO intelligence operations reportedly heightened aerial surveillance across the Baltic Sea to monitor possible retaliatory moves by Russia's Northern Fleet, headquartered, ironically, just west of the flames. As Western defense experts pointed out in a late October 2025 NATO report, this was no mere act of sabotage. It marked the transformation of the conflict into a multi-front energy war where pipelines, refineries, and shipping routes became legitimate battlegrounds. And for the first time, those battlegrounds included St. Petersburg itself. If even Putin's hometown could be breached twice in 1 week, what other safe zones might crumble next? What kind of intelligence network can coordinate a strike 1,000 kilometers deep into enemy territory without detection? The answer lies in the unprecedented precision of Ukraine's combined intelligence and drone warfare system. A synergy between the GUR, the SBU, and Western technical support operating quietly in the background. The Kirishi refinery southeast of St. Petersburg was not chosen randomly. According to data from the Institute for the Study of War and open-source Analysts, it was selected because it represents 7% of Russia's total refining capacity, feeding not only St. Petersburg and Moscow, but also the Russian military's northern logistics corridor. The attack on October 3 to 4, 2025 unfolded in 3 calculated waves. Ukraine launched domestically produced long-range kamikaze drones, reportedly an upgraded version of the Beaver and UJ-26 Bodan systems, enhanced with NATO-grade navigation chips and thermal imaging. According to Defense News, these UAVs were programmed to fly low over forests and waterways, slipping beneath Russian radar coverage before ascending for the final dive toward their targets. The drone's extended range, estimated at over 100 kilometers, was a direct result of Ukraine's domestic innovations combined with Western-provided microelectronics that survived the sanctions loopholes. As the first wave struck the refinery's distillation, Tower's emergency teams rushed in only for a second wave to arrive minutes later, targeting the very areas where repairs had begun. The timing showed near real-time surveillance updates, a NATO air defense expert told Al Jazeera, suggesting Ukraine had likely used a hybrid network of satellite and electronic reconnaissance shared by Western partners. Though President Trump's administration publicly reaffirmed that no U.S. weapons were used in the operation, multiple Western outlets, including Reuters, reported that American intelligence likely played a role in early warning detection of Russian radar gaps. The Kirishi facility itself, modernized in 2017 by Lukoil, with Western machinery from Siemens and Honeywell, was Russia's pride in energy independence. Yet those very Western components became its fatal weakness. A leaked document cited by DW revealed that replacement turbines and compressors were unavailable due to export sanctions, meaning the refinery's critical systems could not be easily restored. Within 24 hours of the strike, Russian engineers admitted privately that repairs could take months or longer. Local residents described the night sky turning crimson as the flames reached storage tanks, causing secondary explosions that lit up the horizon. Satellite footage from the European Space Agency's Sentinel-2 confirmed heat signatures exceeding 900 degrees, an inferno visible from space. Russian emergency services claimed to have contained the fire within hours, but high-resolution images proved that flare stacks burned continuously for more than a day. Strategically, the attack also tested Russia's military posture near the Baltic. NATO's Northern Command noted an unusual surge of communications from the Russian Baltic Fleet's Kronstadt base in the aftermath, suggesting fears of a follow-up strike. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute concluded that Kyiv's goal was not only destruction, but deterrence, demonstrating reach, timing, and control. Inside, Russia shock turned to disbelief. How could a nation boasting the world's densest air defense network fail twice in a single week? Was it incompetence, or had Russia's strategic defenses been hollowed out by years of corruption and complacency? Even pro-Kremlin commentators began to ask the unthinkable: if drones could reach Kirishi undetected, what might stop them from reaching Moscow itself? The flames over the refinery were more than an industrial disaster. They were a sign that Russia's strategic depth was evaporating. And as Ukraine's long-range capabilities improved, Western observers began to speculate, would this be the beginning of a new era, where geography no longer offered protection? How can an oil superpower run out of its own lifeblood? Within hours of the Kirishi strike, Russia's most advanced refinery was reduced to a skeleton of twisted steel and molten towers. Officially, the government labeled it a localized fire. But satellite data and open-source mapping told a darker truth. Entire processing units were obliterated, and crude flow from nearby terminals had halted. The refinery's paralysis marked not just a local disaster, but a seismic shock to the entire Russian economy. Kirishi was more than a refinery. It was a nerve center supplying refined fuel to civilian networks and military outposts alike. According to Reuters, it processed over 20 million tons of crude, annually roughly 7% of Russia's total refining capacity. That figure alone explains the magnitude of the blow. When production stopped, everything connected to it, aviation fuel to St. Petersburg's Pulkovo airport, diesel for military convoys, and jet fuel exports through Ust-Luga, froze instantly. Western experts like Dr. Maria Thompson of the Atlantic Council called this a surgical strike on the bloodstream of the Kremlin's war economy. She noted that Russia's energy infrastructure, already strained under sanctions, could not replace lost refining output easily. Replacement parts, turbines, compressors, and high-pressure control valves were originally imported from Siemens and Honeywell. Sanctions now made them impossible to obtain. According to a DW report in late October 2025, Russian engineers were forced to salvage components from other refineries, cannibalizing the system, to maintain minimal output elsewhere. The economic shock was immediate. Russian fuel futures spiked by 35% overnight, while domestic gasoline prices began climbing steadily. The central bank was forced to intervene to stabilize the ruble, which slipped against the dollar despite President Trump's administration tightening export control enforcement on dual-use technologies entering Russia. The cascading effect spread beyond energy logistics, slowed rail shipments declined, and consumer prices rose sharply. On the Baltic coast, export terminals that once pumped millions of barrels of diesel and jet fuel daily fell silent. According to BBC News, Europe maritime tracking data revealed a sudden drop of nearly 40% in petroleum product exports in the week following the attack. This cost Russia roughly $500 million in lost revenue. The Kremlin, dependent on these energy earnings to fund its military operations in Ukraine, now faced a financial chokehold of its own making. Inside Russia, public trust began to fracture. St. Petersburg residents watched as smoke still curled over the horizon days after officials claimed the fire was extinguished. Videos circulating on Telegram showed long convoys of fuel trucks idling outside empty depots. "There's no fuel to move the fuel," one driver said grimly in a clip verified by OSINT analysts. Internationally, analysts compared this event to the 1941 bombing of Baku, a historical blow to energy logistics that reshaped wartime economies. But in this case, the irony ran deeper. The very city Peter the Great had built to connect Russia to Europe was now severed by weapons developed with Western technology. "This is the closure of the imperial window," wrote The Guardian, "not by diplomacy, but by fire." Within NATO circles, the strike on Kirishi was studied as a case study in hybrid warfare. It blended cyber intelligence, drone tactics, and economic disruption, a perfect storm of 21st century conflict. A confidential report from NATO's Energy Security Center in Lithuania suggested that Ukraine's targeting pattern aimed to undermine Russian resilience not through total destruction, but through long-term paralysis. As the flames at Kirishi dimmed, the real crisis was only beginning, one measured not in explosions, but in shortages, silence, and spreading despair. Could Russia's mighty oil machine recover? Or had Ukraine just opened a wound that could never fully heal? What happens when the pumps run dry in the world's largest oil exporter? In the days following the Kirishi attack, scenes emerged across Russia that few citizens had imagined possible: endless lines at gas stations, arguments turning into brawls, and desperate motorists sleeping in their cars through freezing autumn nights. According to Reuters and DW, more than half of all gas stations in the Leningrad and Pskov regions were either closed or rationing supplies by mid-October 2025. The sign posted on countless pumps told a simple, devastating truth: no gasoline. It wasn't just an economic inconvenience, it was a social shockwave. For years, Russian propaganda had portrayed war as something far away, confined to Ukraine's battlefields. But as the BBC reported, the explosions over St. Petersburg had erased that illusion overnight. Now the effects were in every household. Commuters could no longer reach work, ambulances ran out of fuel, and police patrols in some districts were reportedly limited to essential responses only. Regional governors imposed ration cards, allowing only 20 liters per car, a measure unseen since the Soviet collapse. Food delivery apps and courier services, lifelines for urban life, began collapsing under fuel constraints. It feels like 1991 all over again, a resident in Novgorod told Al Jazeera. Except this time, we're supposed to be an energy superpower. The economic ripple spread fast. Inflation soared as transport costs multiplied. The ruble, already weakened by sanctions and dwindling energy exports, continued to slide. Russia's Ministry of Energy attempted to calm the public by promising quick repairs at Kirishi, but independent analysts, including the International Energy Agency (IEA), estimated that even partial restoration could take 6 to 12 months, and that was optimistic. The Kremlin blamed Ukrainian terrorism and vowed retaliation. Yet inside Russia, the anger began turning inward. Social media, despite heavy censorship, was flooded with sarcastic memes asking, "Where is the world's second-largest oil producer now?" The Moscow Times reported growing frustration among truckers, farmers, and taxi drivers whose livelihoods vanished almost overnight. Videos of physical fights at petrol stations went viral before being scrubbed from state platforms. Military insiders quietly admitted the crisis had logistical implications for the army. Diesel shortages delayed convoys and reduced the number of supply rotations to the front. In southern regions like Rostov and Belgorod, reservists reportedly struggled to refuel their vehicles. When the civilian economy collapses, the military cannot stand apart, one unnamed Russian logistics officer told Defense News Europe. Meanwhile, Western observers saw a deeper shift, not just a fuel shortage, but a collapse of the psychological contract between the Russian state and its people. For 2 decades, Putin had promised stability in exchange for obedience. Now, as smoke rose over St. Petersburg, that bargain was broken. A regime that can't keep the lights on or the fuel flowing cannot claim to defend its citizens, argued political analyst Tatiana Stanovaya in The Economist. In Washington, President Donald Trump addressed the situation, cautiously emphasizing that the U.S. supports Europe's energy security and stability, while urging NATO partners to prepare for potential escalations in the Baltic theater. Behind closed doors, NATO strategists interpreted the Kirishi attack as a psychological turning point, proof that Ukraine had successfully shifted the war's emotional burden into Russia's heartland. By late October, reports from Belarus confirmed gasoline shortages spreading there too, a stunning symbol of how deeply Russia's crisis had infected its closest ally. One Belarusian trucker put it bluntly, "If Moscow can't fuel itself, how will it fuel us?" As winter approached, the shortages deepened. Russians hoarded fuel, abandoned cars, and turned to illegal street dealers, selling canisters at 4 times the official price. The question now wasn't whether the crisis would end, but whether Russia's social fabric could survive it. Can an army still fight when its tanks and aircraft have no fuel? By mid-October 2025, the consequences of the Kirishi strike had rippled far beyond the civilian economy. Inside Russia's vast military apparatus, commanders began to feel the strangling effect of the energy crisis. The very foundation of Moscow's war doctrine, the concept of strategic depth, was disintegrating. For decades, Russia's military strength relied on its immense geography distance as defense size as shield. But Ukraine's new long-range drone strategy had changed the calculus entirely. According to Defense News and NATO's October Energy Security Report, Ukrainian drones had now proven capable of striking up to 200 kilometers inside Russian territory, deep enough to reach critical supply nodes once thought untouchable. The once reliable assumption that no enemy could reach the industrial centers beyond the Urals was now obsolete. Kirishi's destruction disrupted the military's lifeblood diesel and aviation fuel. Field reports obtained by BBC Monitoring indicated that armored units along the northern front received only 60% of their usual fuel allotment in the weeks following the attack. Logistical convoys stalled. Repair crews were grounded. In the Belgorod and Kursk sectors, drone reconnaissance captured images of Russian supply trucks abandoned on rural roads, victims not of enemy fire, but of empty tanks. At air bases across the western military district, sorties declined sharply. Analysts from the Royal United Services Institute observed that the Russian Air Force's daily flight rate had fallen by nearly 40% due to shortages of high-octane aviation fuel, the kind refined exclusively at facilities like Kirishi. No fuel means no air power, wrote Dr. Keir Giles in a recent RUSI brief. Ukraine has found a way to silence the Russian Air Force without firing a single missile. The knock-on effects were strategic and psychological. With fewer tank maneuvers, artillery resupply slowed, and the tempo of operations collapsed. Ukrainian forces seized the opportunity to press forward around Kupiansk and Lyman, advancing on supply depots weakened by fuel delays. Western military analysts described this as the first war won through fuel starvation. Behind closed doors, NATO planners saw something larger taking shape, a shift in warfare itself. The Financial Times cited internal NATO memos suggesting that Ukraine's campaign had created a new model of energy attrition, where drones replace bombs as instruments of economic siege. By striking refineries instead of barracks, Kyiv was dismantling Russia's capacity to wage war from within. Meanwhile, morale at the front began to crumble. Soldiers received messages from their families describing shortages, blackouts, and empty stores back home. They're fighting for a state that can't fuel their parents' cars or heat their homes, observed former U.S. Army strategist Lieutenant Col Daniel Davis in Al Jazeera's Inside Story. That kind of psychological fracture is far more dangerous than a lost tank. Russia's internal propaganda machine scrambled to control the narrative, portraying the crisis as temporary and promising swift retaliation. Yet evidence from OSINT networks suggested that repair efforts at Kirishi were stalled by the unavailability of Western replacement parts. Components Moscow could neither replicate nor import, due to the Trump administration's tightened export controls. Even in Moscow, power rationing began in industrial zones, a move not seen since the early post-Soviet years. The energy imbalance was spreading fast, and with each passing week, Russia's military mobility shrank. Ukraine, for its part, maintained strategic ambiguity. Officials in Kyiv neither confirmed nor denied responsibility for each specific strike. But the message was unmistakable: distance was no longer protection, and Russia's own size, once its greatest advantage, had become its greatest weakness. If Russia's war machine was running on fumes, how long could Putin sustain both his battlefield ambitions and his image of control before something or someone finally broke? Can a regime survive when its greatest strength becomes its downfall? By November 2025, analysts from the New York Times and Deutsche Welle agreed the Kirishi strike marked the moment Russia's war turned inward. The battlefield was no longer in Donetsk or Kherson, but in every gas station, factory, and darkened apartment across the Federation. The myth of a distant war had died. Inside, Russia fear gave way to something more corrosive: doubt. Ordinary citizens, long assured that the Kremlin's power was absolute, now whispered the unthinkable: if St. Petersburg isn't safe, what city is? The images of fire above the Neva became an emblem of failure, circulating despite censorship. Videos of refinery workers fleeing the flames were quietly shared on encrypted apps. According to Al Jazeera English, these leaks did more damage to public confidence than any foreign broadcast. Western think tanks saw a rare psychological collapse taking shape. Putin's aura of control was built on the idea of protection, wrote defense analyst Ben Hodges in The Guardian. Once that illusion burns, no amount of propaganda can put it back together. The U.S. under President Donald Trump officially maintained distance from Ukraine's operations, but quietly praised the strategic precision that exposed the vulnerability of Russia's war economy. NATO, meanwhile, intensified satellite surveillance over the Baltic region, concerned that Moscow might lash out at alliance infrastructure in response. Economically, Russia was bleeding. With Kirishi offline and exports through Ust-Luga reduced by half, Reuters markets estimated weekly revenue losses exceeding $600 million. The ruble plunged again as panic buying gripped major cities. Food distribution faltered because diesel reserves were prioritized for the military, which was itself running low. Trains carrying ammunition from Yekaterinburg slowed to a crawl. Cargo convoys in the south were grounded. Even nuclear facilities reportedly faced temporary transport disruptions due to the diesel shortage, though the Kremlin denied this. The crisis had also transformed geopolitics. India and China, Russia's primary energy customers since European sanctions, began demanding steep discounts on crude shipments, citing logistical instability. Analysts at Bloomberg Energy noted that Russia was now selling its oil at a loss merely to sustain cash flow. This is not just a refinery burning, said economist Alexandra Prokopenko. It's the financial heart of the Kremlin hemorrhaging currency. At home, protests grew in small but symbolic ways. In Tver and Nizhny Novgorod, truckers blocked highways demanding fair fuel distribution. Police cracked down, but video evidence of the unrest spread online faster than censors could act. It feels like the beginning of something larger, commented DW correspondent Yuri Makarov. People are realizing that the war they ignored has arrived at their doorsteps. For Ukraine, this psychological shift was the true objective. Kyiv's intelligence chief, in a statement to BBC World, described the campaign as designed to make Russians see the cost of aggression in their own mirrors. Western experts called it the most successful example of economic warfare through precision technology in modern history. Drones had replaced bombers. Panic had replaced propaganda. As NATO diplomats quietly prepared for the next winter of energy instability, the question hanging over Moscow was no longer if, but when, the regime's internal pressure would reach the breaking point. The Kirishi strike had done more than damage infrastructure. It had fractured the story Russia told about itself. If Ukraine's drones could set fire to the symbol of Putin's power, what would happen when ordinary Russians finally realized the flames had already reached their own home?